Republican lawmakers have hardly stood up to Donald Trump's politics, but things appear to be changing lately. This week, Trump faced opposition on two issues very close to him: money for the White House ballroom and a $1.8 billion fund, which critics have argued would reward Trump's supporters and allies. Is Trump starting to lose the Republican Party, or will he quickly overcome the opposition? We are discussing this with Andra Gillespie, political scientist from Emory University in Atlanta. Andra, first tell us, are you surprised to see Republicans not giving their full backing to Trump's latest packages?
Well, I can't say that I'm surprised, but I don't know exactly what is going to happen next. This is not the first time that we have seen Republicans raise objections to some actions by the Trump administration. And there have been some instances where President Trump has backed down from a policy proposal that he has introduced because the Republican backlash has been swift and strong. Whether or not that actually constitutes sustained opposition to the president that could check executive political power, I think is an open question. And if history is any sign, I would not be holding my breath for that to be happening as a result of this. There are some things that could be different this time around, but it would take sustained opposition for me to say that we're in an era where, President Trump has broken up with Senate Republicans.
And let's talk about the $1.8 billion compensation fund. Why are some Republicans concerned about it?
Well, I mean, there are many concerns with this particular issue. One, Congress has the power of the purse, and they have written laws that will allow the executive branch to be able to make certain types of settlements. There is an important legal and constitutional question here about whether or not this type of fund actually kind of hews to the laws that have been passed over the last 70, 80 years that would allow for the executive branch to make certain types of compensation to people based on legal cases. There's also the issue of the constitution of this particular board. So the board that will make a decision about whether or not somebody could get restitution from this weaponization fund is going to be controlled by the executive branch. And people who are on the branch could be fired for cause. So in theory, if somebody chooses to not make restitution or votes to not make restitution for somebody who President Trump is sympathetic to, they could be fired for not actually exercising their authority to, limit who can get access to this award. Secondly, I mean, there's also this larger issue of whether or not Congress should be ceding this type of power. Article 1 is very, very clear. The money in our country is controlled by Congress. The people have a say in how their money is spent. And so to have the executive branch use taxpayer money in a way that Congress hasn't specifically allocated is something that is constitutionally suspect. And that's beyond the optics of who, is going to get a sympathetic hearing from this board. Is it, we presume that conservatives who believe that they were unfairly targeted by the Biden administration would, but what about liberals that might have been subjected to surveillance? And so it's not clear that it's going to be distributed or that all cases are going to be handled equally, and that this is just a means of corruption and that it needs oversight. And so part of the reason why you're seeing Congress expressing objections, not voting on key parts of the president's agenda in terms of how it's going to fund immigration, they're just doing this as leverage so that they can exert checks and balances over the executive branch as the Constitution actually intended the legislative branch to do.
And what about the White House ballroom? What's bothering the Republicans about that?
Well, if we put the permitting decisions aside about how demolition kind of took place before there was a plan put in place aside, when this ballroom was first proposed and announced, it was supposed to be paid for entirely with private funds. And so now we're coming up with this issue of there need to be important security measures that arguably could and should be funded by taxpayer dollars, but it's a question of is $1 billion too much? And so again, Congress has the power of the purse. And so they have the right to allocate and to determine how much money will actually be given to this project. There are ways that one might argue that the president of put the cart before the horse in terms of starting demolition before serious plans were actually put into place and approved. And so this is, again, another place where Congress, as the fiduciary over taxpayer dollars, has the right to be able to say how money is being spent. But again, there's also this larger issue of when this was initially built, it was promised to be paid for entirely by private funds and not taxpayer funds. This is why President Trump, arguably felt that he didn't need to consult anybody about it. And so now we're seeing a bit of an about face. And so Congress is raising questions.
Are there signs that Trump may be losing his grip on Republicans? First, let's hear what the president said when he was asked a question about his grip on the U.S. Senate.
Are you losing control of the Senate Republic?
I don't know. I really don't know. I can tell you, I only do what's right.
Andra, what does his response tell us?
Well, I don't know what to make of that response, and I don't know if I would read too much into the response other than it was an off-the-cuff response, and he hadn't had a whole lot of time to think about it. I think the proof is going to be in the pudding as to whether or not you continue to see Senate Republicans oppose the president's agenda, hold up deliberating on key bills that President Trump and his administration deem important in the next couple of weeks. So we have seen right now that there are Republicans who are vocalizing opposition. Are these people saying the same thing a couple of weeks from now? Are they saying the same thing a month from now? Are they willing to speak truth to power, if you will, 2 or 3 months from now or at the end of the summer? If we see kind of a reversion back to sort of what is typical behavior amongst members of the Republican caucus in the House and the Senate, but in the Senate particularly, then I would argue that this was just another temporary moment. Now, one thing that might be different this time around is that President Trump has been really successful in challenging sitting members of Congress who have consistently opposed his agenda or opposed him on some very, very key issues. So this week, Congressman Thomas Massie from Kentucky lost his primary election, so he will not be able to run as a Republican. He won't be able to run at all, actually, for Congress from Kentucky. And then last Saturday, Senator Bill Cassidy also lost a primary challenge. So he is no longer going to be a senator as of January. And so one of the people who has spoken out, if we look at sort of how he voted on basically a war powers act in Congress regarding the Iran war, he voted against it along with Democrats. And so there's another primary that's coming up on Tuesday in Texas, where President Trump has actually endorsed the opponent of a sitting member of the Senate who is running, Senator John Cornyn. And so it becomes a question of, as you see people who are losing office, are they more emboldened to basically say what they feel and come out and speak against President Trump? So if you start to see more people doing that because they don't no longer have to worry about, him primarying them because they've already lost an election, then that might sort of gather some momentum. But we've been here before. After January 6th, when President Trump was a lame duck president with only a couple of weeks left, there were people, Republicans, who were vocally in opposition to him. Yet you still didn't see people voting to convict him in his impeachment trial that happened right after he had stepped out of office. And you saw those people become very loyal allies of him during the 2024 election cycle in some but not all cases. So I think we have to wait to see consistent behavior on the parts of a Republican opposition for us to really declare that there is a robust challenge to President Trump's authority.
Andra will speak a bit more about primaries later in the interview, but overall, do you still think that there are cracks appearing in the president's dominance over Republicans?
Like I said, it is too early to say. So yes, there have been instances of Republican opposition this week with respect to war powers and with respect to their opposition to the ballroom and the decision to adjourn the Senate this week. But I think the true kind of test of opposition is whether or not they're actually able to consistently carry this forward, to get some concessions from the administration in exchange for passing the immigration bill, and then also whether or not these same Republicans will stand up to him at the next controversy, which, is likely to happen at some point in the near future. So the reason why I can't say that this is the start of the foundation cracking is because when we have seen these instances before, we've also seen the same legislators then turn around and support the president or his agenda in ways that might appear to be baffling to the regular observer or even to Democrats. So until it is consistent, I can't say that there are cracks.
And Andra, the opposition that we have seen, do you think it may be tied to fears ahead of the midterm elections, considering Donald Trump's sinking approval ratings?
Well, there are some decisions that President Trump has made that Republicans have questioned on strategic grounds. So, for instance, John Cornyn, who's a very respected member of the Republican caucus, right? There are people who've certainly rallied around him, right? And there are concerns that if his opponent wins the Republican nomination in Texas, that it will make it easier for Democrats to be able to compete in that particular state. So people have raised those types of concerns, in a public enough way that it has become part of the media discussion here in the United States. However, just because people raise objections occasionally doesn't necessarily mean that there is an organized opposition that is trying to, collectively oppose the Trump administration. Again, it has to be consistent. And what we have not seen in the Republican caucus is consistent opposition to the president and his policies.
And coming back to the primaries we just discussed, we did see that several Trump critics, they lost after the President Donald Trump targeted their campaigns. Overall, what does that show?
Well, I mean, it shows that President Trump certainly still has command of the Republican Party and the Republican electorate in particular. He's taking advantage of the fact that in primary elections, the type of voter who is most likely to show up is, one, going to be partisan, because in many states, the only people who can vote in a Republican primary are registered Republicans. That's not true in every state, but it's true in many states. And also the types of people who show up to vote in partisan primaries tend to be the folks who are most heavily identified with the party. And so right now, it still looks like the MAGA wing of the party is dominant in Republican circles and among Republican voters. And so an endorsement from President Trump will carry particular weight with this constituency, and it's manifesting itself in the vote totals that we see for people like Lydia Letlow in Louisiana, or Galrain in Kentucky. And so the question is this going to actually be fruitful also for Ken Paxton in Texas? So yeah, it does matter. And it matters particularly because of the type of people who are more likely to show up in a primary election, who are more likely to kind of be on the ideological extreme and thus, and on the Republican side, be more likely to identify with MAGA. There's a potential for this to be a liability in a general election where you have to appeal to a broader electorate, and somebody who is hard right MAGA may have a really hard time credibly presenting themselves to a moderate voter, to somebody who is politically independent and who might be turned off by what they see in the Republican administration right now. And so right now, President Trump's job approval rating is underwater amongst independents. And so that could prove a liability in the long run, but at least in a primary election, it's allowing him to notch some victories and to vanquish some of his political enemies.
But does the primary results set an example that an opposition to Trump has consequences?
Well, for Republican voters, but in a general election, Democrats have a say in who gets to be their member of Congress or their senator. And in particular, it could be that small sliver of voters who doesn't identify with a party or who ideologically might be moderate. They may be the ones who are casting the deciding votes in this election. And if they're dissatisfied with the course or the direction that the country is heading, and they don't like what the Republican candidates stand for, that could be a liability in highly competitive races. It may not be as much of an issue in states or in congressional districts that are heavily Republican, but in places where you are looking at relatively small margins, that might give Democrats, so long as they campaign effectively, the opportunity that they need in order to be able to flip some seats and to be able to hold on to the seats that they had that themselves were also competitive.
Andra Gillespie, political scientist from Emory University in Atlanta, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And what do you think? How much power does the US president still hold over the Republican Party? Is this the beginning of the end of the Trump era in the Republican Party? Let us know in the comments. If you like this video, please hit that like button. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe.